Okay, I think we are running. Let's get our little show on the road. And for some reason, we are having trouble getting back onto our main little window there. Good Lord, come on, what's the problem? Shit. I've got another screen that's occupying my window here, and I can't seem to get rid of it so that I can see my main menu. Yipes, what the hell? This is very eccentric. It's sort of starting it. There we go. Woof! Yeah, something suddenly went full screen and it was difficult to get off the bloody thing. Strange little menus. Well, anyway, here we are on the 12th of May in our year of doom, continuing Titans, our creationist book on dinosaurs, into a brand new chapter. And this is also a Chinle Luskin week. So we will be going into some material on that, adding on additional stuff. A little bit late getting on because I was busy working on the cosmology chapter for the rocks were there. Gosh, it's an interesting pile of stuff. And it's sorting out all the material and sections on creationist counter cosmologies and little sidebar details. I was just putting in a thing about creationist spin on the Pleiades, not just young Earth creationists, but stuff from way back in 1976. It started out with Hugh Ross. That kind of me that it's been going on that time, all relating to whether or not the Book of Job had predicted cosmological details. And amazingly, John Hartnett ends up dumping cold water on it, saying that people are kind of scrolling a little bit too far on that. So you get some really odd little bedfellows popping up in the field. Anyway, the new chapter here is about dinosaur fossils, is kind of a generic bit. And it looks like from a quick scan through it, a big chunk of it is retreading the CMI apologetics. But they do start off with a whiz bang in terms of a technical paper, which is a 1994 paper by Schwartz and Gillette on the Coelophysis quarry in the Triassic Chinle Formation in Mexico, Ghost Ranch. And creationists have had a long-standing obsession with, we got our little doodad there, no coming there. I'm trying to see whether or not, yeah. Okay, make sure our little overlay is in place. Yeah. The creationists have had a long-standing obsession with fossil graveyards, mass graveyards. Anybody that's familiar with the actual fossil record is well aware of the fact that there's very few of those in the world. They're so unusual that paleontologists practically pop the champagne corks. And the creationists are routinely misrepresenting the material. This was certainly Taurus, which was told in the Richetics. If you download the stuff that I've got, the three back revolutionary episodes, PDFs, and that from my website, you can find out an awful lot about the Richard Milton background episode. Anyway, the Coelophysis is a very small dinosaur, roughly the same size as your little Archaeopteryx. It's not very large. I think, in fact, it was one of the ones that was the little pack hunters in the second Jurassic Park movie. And what you've got are dinosaurs, looks about 1,000 or more, that bits and pieces of which 95% of the bones belong to just that one species. About 25% of them are in a complete form. So there's an awful lot of bits and pieces. And this Schwartz and Gillette paper is quite clear in indicating that about 30 tons of dirt were removed from the site and that it was caused from a bunch of small dinosaurs that got washed into a small channel where they kind of clawed bits and pieces came in. And so we're talking like a flash flood environment is perfectly feasible to do. Especially feasible, do you look at how big the deposit was, which, by the way, Sarfati and Tate make no effort whatsoever. They're just name dropping the paper. They're not discussing anything about any of the details of the deposit. Well, I was curious to look. So what you got is a hillside and a cliffside, and the stretch of the deposit is 10.5 meters wide and 4.4 meters high, which is roughly the side of my house, the long side. In other words, it's not a huge area. There, of course, they're gradually digging in. That's where the 30 tons of dirt came from, as they're excavating into this hillside. How far back the material goes, we don't know. You'd have to excavate the whole thing. But the physical expanse of that slice is a teeny little spot on a very, very large landscape. And there's no evidence whatsoever that the creationists have gotten to the point of detailing any of that. The various papers that I'm going to be citing along with it are not showing up in their treatment. There's a 2003 paper from Heckert et al., which is on the coelophysids and their larger distribution and so forth. And then there are paleo environments to consider. And there's a 2000 paper from Therine and Fastovsky, which goes on to Ghost Ranch and also two other sections of that Chinle deposit. And they're looking at the larger paleo environment conditions, which you could compare with the nothing burger that you're getting on the creationist side. If the data were actually as supportive of creationism as they would insist, you'd think they would jump at the opportunity to explain at every opportunity all the little fiddly bit detailed science stuff that fits their clearly identified model, and they would have topographical maps showing what the pre-flood environment was like and then what happens to the point and how it got turned into what it is now. Well, if they tried to do that, you would immediately start slamming into how every stage in the process was impossible. That they're not able to make sense of the pre-flood environment. They're not able to make sense of how it got turned into a hillside and a rock. They're not able to deal with any of this stuff in any fundamental sense. And this is across the board. You'd think that if they could have come up with this stuff, they would have been doing it by now, because you've got an awful lot of very bright live wires knocking around in the creationist community. And between the bunch at ICR and CMI and AIG and then the new creationists and all the little sidebar people, of which there's a certain amount of overlap, you've certainly got dozens of people who could be active in this field. And yet there's been no coherent picture. There's everybody operating from their little niche. And I don't anticipate this ever changing, because they're never going to be able to make sense out of a scenario that isn't true to begin with. In the same sense, the conspiracy thinkers have problems making sense of any of their scenarios, like the people who think we never landed on the moon, or Kennedy assassination groupies, or 9/11 conspiracy thinking. There's always a degree of vagueness at critical junctures, and that's certainly the case with the creationism movement regarding every bit that they could deal with. So let us move on to good old Luskin list, installment number 27. They passed 100 papers into their list. This set is a set of 4. I was going to spill over to a 5th one, but it turned out that one of the subjects of the 5th paper, there's a whole slew of papers on the Luskin list that deal with that. So I'm going to make that the next installment in 2 weeks. Some of the stuff is just basically repeating the same points that we've already encountered, which is, some ALUs are all over the place. And they can alter the topology of organisms. They can cause interconnections to trigger. But the core issue that the Luskin argument needed to have defended was the idea that the majority of ALUs and retrotransposons and air quotes junk DNA actually does something functional. And none of these papers are, again, supporting that position. At the most, they're simply reiterating the fact that you can have, given there's 1.5 million ALUs alone, you can have thousands of examples of actual interaction and actual functionality. And that's still a tiny proportion of the total, which, of course, is the main point that Dan Stern Cardinale and others have pointed out, that you can get maybe 20% of all of it is very reasonably doing something. But that's a far cry from 50% or the grand hope that it would be functionally all, because it is not something that the intelligent design and creationist model is particularly fond of. The idea that there would be useless crap designed deliberately into the system. So we got a 2020 paper from Herbert, which is suggesting that ALU's capacity to insert itself and link into DNA could be harnessed therapeutically. In other words, mimicking the sort of things that happen in nature. Perfectly reasonable, perfectly intelligent, because it's that coding happens to have a copy me repetition bit. It's the same thing as the groups that latched on to CRISPR, because of its ability to just come in and inveigle itself into things, and you can use it for therapeutic and diagnostic circumstances as a precision tool. And then there is a paper from 2020, Perez Molina et al., on intronic ALU elements and how these connect up to aspects of gene regulation, and including protecting against potential epigenetic silencing. So there again, you've got the linkage ability that the system effectively co-opts these things for practical utility. And the fact that there's so many of them means that if you have a molecule that is triggered by the ALU signal, it's relatively easy to find this stuff because there's so many of them around. So it's a fascinating little dynamic as to how these things can get inveigled in. Doesn't claim that the vast majority of them are actually doing anything. 2 of the 4 papers that we're dealing with are specifically about a thing that I hadn't heard about before, the Sign VNTR ALU blob. Paper from 2019 from Gianfresco et al., which apparently was quite a preliminary study going into this. And then the glorious one from 2020, Ashley Hall et al. That one slams into the disease context in the very first paragraph, because they're identifying that these hominid human variants show up in the brain, true enough, but imply they'll be connected to diseases as they can arise from interacting elements that are on their own fairly low incidence. So the idea that you've got all of this junk DNA knocking around that inveigles and stuff, and some diseases can come about by linkages from things that are not in and of themselves terribly dangerous, but in combination end up being that way. And that was the thing that the paper was explicitly hinting at in 2020. So we moved downstream, and it turns out that's pretty much the direction that their research has been going. That's why they were so concerned about pinning all this down, because they've got a 2024 follow-up, which is not on the list, but it predates the article, I think, so they theoretically could have encountered it, which was laying out the various diseases where such insertions are likely playing a part. And then there's a paper from 2024, which is even more recent, that I wouldn't have expected them to be on it, Froelich et al., which is explicitly on that particular Sign VNTR ALUs as, quote, as a biomarker of Parkinson's disease progression. So that one slams directly into the theodicy angle. We have to wonder, did anybody in the Discovery Institute, when they were compiling these things, and it's entirely possible given the mishmash, they're not alphabetical, they're kind of clumped according to types, and it's very possible that they structure these various people may have compiled them together, and somebody compiled them as a master listing, and that's what came to be the case, because none of them are annotated or detailed. There's a certain inconsistency at times in how things are typed and the like, which suggests that some of these things are being intruded by different writers. and some occasional spelling errors. And I think we noted in a previous installment how there was some confusion about who, with this one of these Chinese names where it's not immediately obvious which one is the first name and which one is the last. And so to some extent, they were confusing the two. That sort of thing can happen as well. So I'll be linking all of those papers onto there, including the one on the Parkinson's disease progression, because they're all open access and you can all dive into the matter. This is still retaining the track record that almost a third of the material that they're bringing up has the Theodicy disease connection. And that means that in principle, there's a whole bunch of these supposedly designed elements that would indicate that the designer was slapdash or deliberately designing things so that they could have diseases. Luskin and company certainly are aware of the matter because it's been brought up at various points, but they don't like to think through that much. They kind of shift back into the subject and get it to their little cuddle blankets. It's going to be fun to see finally when I got all the listing done, and it'll be a while at the rate I'm going, to find out what the whole Theodicy variant is and what topics and elements have been hit upon in this that are really fascinating topics and scientifically interesting, as we've encountered in previous episodes. They're just not helping the intelligent thing. Hi, Brian. Yeah, so I'm just, this is one of our little Luskin Week episodes that is continuing the boring process of documenting for everybody to see that the Luskin claim that there are 800 papers plus that support the intelligent design idea that junk DNA is actually functional, that when you look at them paper by paper by paper, the most you can do is that some are functional and that the sum levels are no different than the things that were laid out by Dan Stern Cardinale, which was the reason why they were trying to dump this bloody list on it. Remember, so far, we've only had one paper, which we noted in the very first episode, that if you read it loosely enough, might think there was a door opening, at least, for the idea of a grand functionality. This was dating back farther back in time when the ENCODE project had a little bit higher hopes. But there's been no paper since then that we've encountered, and the vast majority of these things are from the 2020s, that fit that model or not. So it's going to be an interesting little tidbit. Jackson has sent me his next chapter, which is going to be discussing things on bird origins and some other little topics. That's also going to have stuff that I will be interpolating regarding whale evolution, which is one of the interesting little topics to see how creationists dither on the subject, and also the whole paleo world stuff. 800 individual sheets of toilet paper, maybe. Yeah. Well, to be fair, they're perfectly legitimate papers. I mean, these are all this, none of which is involving. Come on, there we go. Make sure my little show and hide thing is still functioning. We were getting a little bit of a glitch up earlier in the show. There's a cottage tradition in the group here, anti-evolution movement, yikes, to trawl sources like that. Ashby Camp over in the Young Earth Creationist camp had a mammoth reference bibliography that's still available online in various spots, where they would be dumping masses of papers on particular topics. And because he's a Young Earth Creationist, it sprawls all over the field. In fact, quite a lot of the stuff that's showing up in the cosmology chapter that creationists have played off of are ones that were on the Ashby Camp list. The intelligent design crowd wants to be much more selective and remain in-house. So they very rarely wiggle outside of that mode. They would prefer, in the rare instances when any of their camp actually does a thing in a non-intelligent design publication, which is now just one, the biocomplexity, that's semi-moribund. But there's not a great deal of that. And so it often is just coverage of the public discussions that are going back and forth, or books. Somebody comes up with a new book, or in some cases an old book, that they then decide to trawl onto. But the technical side of it, I think there was a degree of overreach on their part. A big chunk of them, in fact, when I compiled the reference bibliography for this thing to go through one by one, I made a point of highlighting all the ALU references. And the vast majority of this whole initial section, in fact, the biggest block of all of the papers that we're going to be doing, are in this block of the retrotransposons, and a huge number of those relate to ALUs. So they would just see ALU and they would have it in their head that ALUs are junk DNA, and therefore, if there's a paper on some activity of it, ta-da, it's supporting their case, and boop, in it goes. Did they read the papers? First of all, it could be argued that the time it takes to go through the papers, if I spent continuous time, I suppose I could plow through these much, much more rapidly. But you'd still have the thing, it would take a hell of a long time to go through 800 papers. And given the speed with which they posted this original post, you got to wonder how many of them they could ever have bothered to read beyond just the title or abstract. And in some cases, as was in the example of this Ashley Hall paper today, they didn't have to go very far to find stuff that was directly indicating that something more is going on here than what the intelligent design argument wants. Did they spend the time to go down at least to the conclusions parts of the paper? That's a critical area that Danster and Cardinali and other people who are from the science field will point out is a method that you will want to make use when evaluating a science paper. Yes, you got the abstract, and of course, all the meat of the stuff in between is important, but the discussion conclusions section is also, if anything, more important than just the abstract. The abstract is just a little quickie summary, but the meat of their conclusions, and often the pivotal information that they're trying to highlight, is going to be done in that section. And so if you're not looking at that and just rimming off of the first page or so, you could easily get into trouble. And I think it's entirely possible that the Discovery Institute didn't even get into that level of analysis, but it's giving us some time to fiddle with week after week, month after month, and all that. A similar one that will be a topic eventually, I want to do a book, which I will be calling the Coulter-Kampf book, which is about the attempts by anti-evolutionists to take over. They've been cherry picking things that, if read, actually didn't support them, and even debunked some of the arguments for how long now. Oh, well, depending on the group, this process certainly was happening all the way back in classical creationism. So you can find, there we go. You can find elements of that quote mining stuff on a smaller scale by the 1980s, absolutely. And Luther Sunderland's book, or Sutherland. God, I'm constantly confusing how to remember his name. Sunderland or Sunderland, I think, who would go around and haunt evolutionists with a recording apparatus and try to get them to do incriminating statements. The notorious example was with Colin Patterson that figures in Evolution Slam Dunk, and we allude to it a bit in Rocks for There. And you have various people that would do quote mining lists. The technical paper lists, Ashby Camp would be an example of that, and there would be sidebars of that. It's a thing that you really have to be kind of anal retentive on, and the bunch at the Intelligent Design Movement really started doing this more relentlessly. So certainly by 2004 or so, you would find Chinle Luskin and their crowd doing these long parades of intelligent design support lists. You would get it on a smaller scale individually on topics. So Gunter Beckley would pull off some of that stuff in the series that he would be doing on Cambrian and Precambrian organisms, and we'll be alluding to a lot of that in the new book in the section on that period. But yeah, it's a specialized thing because it's a boring task to compile, and of course runs the risk of nerds like me coming along and diving in and looking at them. I mentioned a few weeks back the bit where Dave Farina had decided to look into the various papers that were being put forward on the trans mice claim that President Trump was giving in his State of the Union message, and that they had a posting where they were supposedly documenting. At least they had the chutzpah to quote mine sections of it. It wasn't an unannotated listing, although that doesn't help them, because then you can see exactly what information they're trying to present, and then you can compare that against the actual content of the paper to see how they're cherry picking stuff. But this Luskin list, it isn't even cherry picking, because it's just a technical paper, page after page after page after page after page of it. What I did so that I could make some better sense of the thing is, this is a technique I would recommend anybody use, rather than relying on merely printing up or having a copy of internet material. I will copy the text of the internet material and eliminate all the little sidebars, because there may be ads, there may be additional sidebars where they're linking to other stuff. Basically, you're just trying to get the text down to a point and have that in a doc file. Now, once it's in a doc file format, I can consult it whenever I like, and I can do text search. So if I want to find out if a particular topic has come up or not, kaboom. That's how I could do with, say, an entire creationist book that I have saved that was available online at Answers in Genesis. So it's, it's not thieving or anything. And some PDFs you can do text search in, but others you can't. And sometimes that can be a rather annoying thing. I mean, there's nothing more joyful than trying to plow down through a 400-page old book in German when I have to trot up my old college German to make sense out of it, and I can't do text search. So I can't go looking for a particular diagnostic word to try to find a particular thing. That means you have to go through page by page by page. But that's the stuff you have to deal with. But everybody should be trying to do things where they can control and manage the information flow, so they can consult the thing and document stuff as good as possible. When I watch videos, if I'm particularly interested in the material, especially if it's likely to be juicy, controversial, I will follow along, and I will do transcripts of the statements in the video, so that I will have a hard copy text version of it in a doc file, so that I can access that information and work off of it. I'd say at least a third of the time when I go to that trouble, it produces some really neat examples of misrepresentation, as somebody is getting all revved up and making a statement that was, as soon as you put it down in print, you realize, holy moly, do they realize what they just said? That's been the case with some of the creationists that Dapper Dino has done videos and stuff on. So I take background information on that stuff. So there's varying layers that you can deal with as to how you're supposed to best approach the material. Always, 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 you want to find primary source material. So especially with people that you agree with, don't take anything they say on gospel. Don't take anything I say on gospel. That's one of the reasons I go to such great pains to put full text links up, so that nobody has to take my word for it. Everybody can look for themselves, investigate for themselves, and I encourage them to do that. And proceed then to track stuff down. Probably the areas that are the most vexing relate to a lot of biblical chronology and biblical terminology, where sometimes it's not easy to find the scholarly journal papers, not all of which may be even online, that would relate to some obscure detail. I was just trying to look up material on what connections there were between the tablet of Shamash and the cosmology of the Bible and things like that. That pops up in relation to the firmament, rakia. And but when you do find material that pins things down at a scholarly level, it's usually extremely juicy. This was coming up as a topic because in the cosmology chapter, there's a bit about whether or not in the Bible the firmament being stretched is supposedly a scientific issue of the expansion of the universe. And you have a little group of people, some creationists and some old Earth creationists, particularly at Reason to Believe, that just went over the rainbow on this. Zwerink, the little fellow at Reasons to Believe, has a long section, the most detailed exposition of this. And boy, he should not have gone this far on this topic. Anyway, of the people that have tried to make a deal about this, and it's from lower bottom feeders all the way up to top poobahs in the creationism movement, none of them, as in zero, had apparently thought to look to see whether anybody in the tradition of biblical scholarship had ever made that heaven stretching connection in the past. Because if it was so obvious a thing, you would have thought people would have come up with that idea before. You wouldn't have taken modern people with their modern telescopes to retrofit an interpretation of it. And as soon as you start looking up the historical scholarship on what the firmament meant to the people in ancient times and in the rabbinical literature and other areas, it turns out to have nothing whatsoever to do with heaven stretching. At most, it's the stretching of the canopy of the godly tabernacle up in the firmament, which again links up to the notions of kingship and thrones and the like that you find in Babylonian culture, which is why this testament of tablet of Shamash was kind of relevant to the point. And it's just some delicious material that I uncovered in the various scholarship on this point, of which none of the creationists have got within a mile on. In the same way that if you're an old Earth creationist and you want to think that the Bible can be somehow agreeable with extremely long ages, you have to wonder why nobody had thought that before. That you find one or two rabbis that you could encounter who might go number happy and think that the days of creation might be billions of years because, whoa, yeah, at a time when nobody else was thinking in those terms. In the same way, from what I've read lately, most cosmologists don't believe the expansion is uniform. Yeah, that's actually, it's a deliciously complicated thing, which is cosmologically interesting, but of course is fodder for creationists to run amok. You have two kinds of expansion issues. One is the general expansion of the universe that may or may not be speeding up or slowing down. And this also relates to the flatness, which is the terminology in relation to the mass distribution and the flatness of the space-time curvature. And it's still kind of an open letter as to whether or not things are the way they are. It sounds like it's sort of accelerating in the general expansion. This is independent from the inflation expansion that is been worked out and is the general model, although you've got naysayers that don't particularly like it for a variety of reasons. But that's where, in fact, it's going to be all summarized on the cute little chart that we will be including in Rocks Were There Volume 2, where we summarize the whole big picture for everybody to be able to see. So you've got the inflationary epoch takes place from 10 to the minus 36 seconds down to 10 to the minus 12 seconds. And so you've got a space of, in terms of Planck time, up to 10 to the 20th Planck ticks. And the universe goes at that point from like 10 centimeters across up to roughly 1 astronomical unit, which is like 90 million miles. So you've got a bit where the universe is microscopic and then whoop, fairly big. And then it kind of settles down, continuing to do its little thing. Whether or not there might have been burps to some of this process or whether other areas, it's very difficult to work out because it's all occurring in the very earliest stages of the universe. You've got a block off. In fact, there's a section on the chart that deals with it. The dark age, which is the box that goes all the way across the middle, which is before stars are appearing. And so the cosmic background radiation is a thing that's after the dark age period. So all of that stuff is, well, the cosmic background, is just slightly before that. It's a reionization period that is occurring as matter is starting to form, but it isn't yet doing stars, so there's not the light being generated by stars yet. And that's quite a long time after the, let me see, the reionization period is taking place from about 240,000 years out to 370,000 years. And so that's about 250,000 years after the Big Bang. That's a lot of stuff going on that's all at the theoretical end. And it's really delicious stuff that's keeping all the cosmologists busy. There's degrees about whether or not space is relatively uniform, or could there be crimplings and ripples in it that would alter the dynamics of things. Can gravity be fixed in the way that we're used to, or does it fall off slightly differently? Does it have variations? There's the various forms of modified Newtonian gravitation. And also, there are some people who would be arguing that maybe inertia might alter slightly depending on circumstances. Were the conditions identical early in the universe, or did they change? You got a lot of stuff going on. And the one thing we can say, though, is whatever little tweaks or adjustments are going to be made in physics, it can't any of them be so big that it would invalidate any of the data we already have. Gas raises many questions as it is answered. Yeah, well, the one group that really shouldn't be satisfied with the James Webb Telescope is the creationists. Although you find Whistling in the Dark, Hartnett and others have been insisting that the James Webb Telescope is just going to be knocking that Big Bang for a loop. No, not really. It's helped to pin down more about the early population 3 stars. It certainly generated a surprise as to how quickly galaxies were forming in stars. But as they start thinking through all of that, the issue that some stars might be dark stars that have a little ripple of dark matter in them, which can alter the dynamics of how they function. The presence of black holes has changed the dynamics, because their presence changes the way their neighbors operate and the rate at which stars form, a whole bunch of stuff. Apparently extremely massive galaxies in the early universe, and with a much higher star formation rate than what we're seeing now. And they're gradually working out the parameters as to why all that's happened. Meanwhile, none of that research is being done by young Earth creationists. It's just not in their wheelhouse. And there's this continual promissory note of creationist astronomy that doesn't really deliver. And the Answers books illustrate this by the goalpost moving, that they have one team do a book, and then the next time the next book has a different group, and they keep changing the characters as to who's being the pundits. There's backpedaling in a lot of areas and a little bit of schisms. Danny Faulkner is in the awkward spot of kind of wanting the creationists to accept dark matter and dark energy and all of that. And there's no great bandwagon to do that outside of Faulkner's array. So it's an interesting dynamic of chasing after the data field, which moves very quickly. So we'll be documenting the latest material on the earliest galaxies and star formation regions. There's quite a lot of that. And of course, when creationists bump into it, like they do with the Orion Nebula and others, where they're harumphing or not paying attention to the bits at all. So the predictive ability of the creationists in this area has been really bad. To be fair, there's very few people involved in it. You got Danny Faulkner, you got John Hartnett, and a handful of people hovering around them. some of the old guard. The Russell Humphreys is still hanging in there, and he keeps pushing his new cosmology, which had a kind of a heyday back in the 1990s and early 2000s, but the rest of the creationist community has kind of cooled on it. He's kind of a cosmocentrist. Robert Gentry is in that ballpark as well. So you got these little interesting little camps that sometimes intersect and sometimes not. Some people kind of jump from one camp to another. And so it's my job to kind of sort everything out and put it in a good context, as well as presenting the solid scientific information in such a way that you can make use of it. And through our well-indexed, well-documented source base, people will be able to navigate around through that, as well as all the other topics that we're bringing up. So anyway, it's going to be a fun and game stuff. Since we're all way past 40 minutes, let me thank our patrons, without whom the old RJ would find it much more awkward to get by. And I greatly appreciate and thank everybody who, especially in these potentially perilous times, are still shelling out a bit of scratch to go along with my book royalties trickling in and my Social Security, which is my whole income base. I wish I had the inherited wealth, even a portion of the inherited wealth of an Elon Musk or Donald Trump or a Tucker Carlson or a Dinesh D'Souza, all of these people that come from bankroll environments. And sorry, I'm a working class person, first person in my family to ever go to college, slogged along in the working environment, and then gone into my retirement years, where I'm much more busy now intellectually than I was when I was working for the man, which results in outputs of these various books. We'll be finishing up Rocks Were There hopefully this year. I'll probably not be able to get Paralogs 3 out until next year, because that's as with Paralogs 2 being shunted by Rocks Volume 1, we're in the same boat on getting the third book out. Although I got all the main plot elements in that out, and so I've got the thing wrestled to the ground in terms of what I want to do, plus good outlines for the remaining series. So it's just a matter of churning them out one by one by one by one. After we finish Rocks Were There Volume 2, the next one in line with Jackson is going to be the book on the conspiracy thinking mindset, which will talk about everything from anti-vaxxers to climate science denialism and flat earthers and a whole bunch of stuff. And so I had quite a lot of material that I've been shunning aside to get that arranged, that will be dealing with that material. And then after that, theoretically, will be what I fear will be a 3-volume effort, given the amount of material I have and the breadth of the topic, which is a work on where religion fits into the human species, or how it evolved, purposes that it does, the dynamics of how it's played out over time, and all of that, because there's a fabulous amount of material that can't possibly be compressed fairly into just a single book. So good at squeezing a penny that Lincoln's grandmother feels it. Yeah, that's there. I have a spendthrift side to my personality, but I don't have the money to be a spendthrift, so I can't afford to do it. But my mother was raised in the Depression, and so she was aware of all of that firsthand, and instilled in all of us kids a level of care and frugality that a whole new bunch of people are, I think, about to discover as Trump 2.0 slams us right into an economic mess. And they'll get to find out what really bad times are. And that will give a retool and a refit. And maybe that will be able to last us another 80 years or 100 years before we hit another speed bump that would pump us into the 22nd century. And I will be gone by then, so I don't have to worry about that. Anyway, let's put our advert up for our little Rocks Were There book, Volume 1. No doubt we will have to do a second one when we get around to come along. There we go. No doubt we will have to do another advert when we do the second book. We'll also have to go on various platforms, hopefully, to advertise the thing. We did a chat with Apologia when the first book came out, and various others. We'll do whatever we can, and everybody that help spread the work on this. It's a grassroots affair. These are not works from conventional publishers, so we don't have an advertising budget or anything else. It's all word of mouth. Roughly 1,000 people on the planet will have copies of The Rocks Were There in one form or another, either electronic ebooks or the hard copy. And we should be able to do even better on volume 2. Those who have the work know that it's well documented, it's a fun read, and it's easily accessible information that you won't find anywhere else. That's one of the reasons why we did the thing the way we did, is to catch me up, everybody up on both the history of the creationism movement and also the science data in such a way that you can get ahead of them rather than to play catch up. One of the things that particularly annoys me about a lot of the criticisms of creationism is too many lone wolves who basically reinvent the wheel. So they dive into the topic, they are unaware of it, and are having to do the research all themselves. And it takes time, and it's exhausting. And if you can speed up that process by learning about the stuff that's already been worked out, and then you can leap forward with fresh approaches rather than having to basically retread the same research that 15 other people have already done before you, but you didn't know about it because you didn't bump into that aspect of it. There's relatively little new in the anti-evolution movement. It's God of the Gaps, and that divides in natural theology, which I like to call gee whiz, and then pretty soon devolves into origins or bust. And that's the whole range. Everything that has happened from the 1870s to the present in anti-evolution apologetics falls into those elements. There's been slight revisions in terms of topics du jour. So the issue about whether evolution is random or not has mutated over time to where the determinism of one generation is replaced by the chance contingency of the other. And so that focus changes in how anti-evolution apologetic attacks it. Individual topics can get shuffleboarded around. Frankly, this tends to happen more in the young earth creationist movement because they crash and burn over so many different areas. Intelligent design is very narrow. It's origins or bust with a dangling of gee whiz. It avoids chronology issues. It avoids the geology and the cosmology. It pretty much accepts the Big Bang and just kind of moves on. So there's a superficiality about it. They'll talk about the Cambrian explosion. They'll talk about junk DNA. There'll be certain tropes that they'll be playing with. But most all of these are things that the regular young earth creationists have been banging their heads about for a lot longer. Plus, they're bumping into other areas where they've got to challenge the geology and the cosmology. Virtually none of the anti-evolution is paying any attention to cognitive literature. And so there's a whole background about why we behave the way we do that when you get discussions of it at all, it's at a very superficial level where they're just basically going after books or Richard Dawkins videos. And it's a pretty superficial stuff. That will be further topics at some point to deal with. I think we'll be alluding to aspects of it in the human evolution chapter for Rocks 2. But some of this stuff is really a deep dive that goes into the philosophy and background stuff that will probably not find me writing material on it until the evolution book, or the evolution of religion book, because it relates to the whole morality and ethics matters and why there is a naturalistic ethics that is reasonable and how distant the top-down God approach is from the data field. Okay. Oh, greetings, sentient beings. Yes. Hi, Purple. Yes. I've just been recounting some of the ups and downs of the process of doing Rocks 2. And it's a fabulous juggling act. I just gradually whittling down through my masses of background notes that relate to an awful lot of creationist literature, some of which are duplicates. So I realize, oh, I've already got a copy of that. Sometimes I've printed 2 or 3, 4 different copies of the same thing over the years because I've been doing research long before I actually started writing books on this stuff. So I would often hit the same topic over and over again. Nearing the end of the structure on the cosmology part, then I'll be moving into solar system formation and all of the stuff relating to the planets, asteroids, comets. These are a whole bunch of tropes. And then along the way, there's going to be a fun bunch on Eric Hovind and Kent Hovind's little worldview and the Greenland ice sheet airplane mythology and the lunar dust myth. And there's a whole bunch of little stuff that's going to be popping up along the way in this. So it's going to be Rocks 2 sounds like a cookbook for people living in poverty. Yes, yes. How to cook granite as opposed to mica, and what wine does one serve with that? Or do you just wine because you have to eat rocks? That could be the bit. Anyway, it's going to be a delightful topic to pull all of this material together. I was very intimidated going into the cosmology issue because I'm a historian. I'm not a physicist, but I'm tackling it from the angle of a scholarly methods approach, where it doesn't matter to the points we're raising who's got the really cute mathematic formulas or not. We're dealing with the extent to which people are paying attention to data field, and if they are misrepresenting its content, independent of the rightness or the wrongness of it. You can have people mangling topics. One of the little points that we'll be raising in the book is the group who are disingenuously, young Earth creationists, disingenuously bringing up Halton Arp and the various steady state crowd without alluding to the fact that in their cosmology, young Earth creationism is impossible too. So they tend to avoid that. Red with biotite, white with muscovite. There we go. I'll go with that. Yes. And then, of course, there are these just hilarious bits of completely contradicting opinions that you wouldn't realize there's a contradiction involved, that you have competing viewpoints if you're limiting yourself to just one network or another. So the extent to which CMI tends to try to report CMI material and AIG tries to keep in-house and ICR keeps in-house means that they can often insulate themselves from it. And there's also, to a certain extent, a concordance on like the date of the flood, which of course we're going to be showing is actually a huge array. The 2348 date is not unique to creationism, that it's just one group that goes with that particular date and their particular versions of the texts. And the fact that so many creationists land all over the place using the same texts or preferring the Septuagint versus the Masoretic and so forth. You can come up with a huge range of date differences on that. And if you're talking about a universe that's only 6,000 years old, 1,000 years matters a lot. In addition to which, of course, they're mangling the history and all that. We're going after Nathaniel Jensen's screwball notions of human origins, and the weird compressed chronology leads to just absolute nonsense and that. And the archaeological area is so mammoth now. We're just barely cutting beneath the surface on the material, and it's enough to indicate just how much the young Earth creationists aren't paying attention to. And if they do bump into it, they just foot stamp and decree things and slough stuff aside. Going to be a big section on soft tissue and going into all the ins and outs of that and how they misrepresented that material. So there's just lots and lots and lots of stuff that we'll be dealing with, and we'll be keeping our eyeballs peeled on all of that. So, so anyway, everybody stay safe. Keep an eye out for the wooden penguins. Watch out for rampaging ice agents and all the other stupidity that's going on in our particular time frame. And I'm waiting for my TikTok countdown to doom clock to occur as to when the crash is going to happen. By the fall, if it seems reasonable, there's going to be a hell of a lot of shortages and messes I think Trump is addicted to his stupid tariffs. Nobody ever asks him for sources on these things, so you have no idea where he's getting these ideas from. Boy, I would love to see people start asking source methods questions of the presidential spokesperson. She might burst into flames if she was asked to do that. So anyway, everybody stay super duper safe, and we will catch you kids all next week, and in 2 weeks, another Luskin episode. So